A terminally ill millionaire was given up on by doctors. But with faith in God and daily prayers, something happened that left everyone speechless. The gleaming glass towers of Grant Pharmaceuticals pierced the Boston skyline, like crystalline monuments to scientific achievement. On the 40th floor, Katherine Grant stood at her floor-to-ceiling window, watching the sunrise paint the city in hues of amber and gold. At 52, she commanded one of the largest pharmaceutical empires in the country, having built it from the ground up, with an unwavering dedication to scientific innovation and a personal vendetta against cancer. Ms. Grant, her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. The board is ready for your presentation. Katherine straightened her tailored charcoal suit and gathered her materials. Today's presentation would unveil their latest breakthrough, a revolutionary immunotherapy treatment that had shown unprecedented success in clinical trials. As she walked through the corridors of her empire, employees nodded respectfully, some averting their eyes from her intense gaze. Katherine had earned a reputation not just for her brilliant mind, but for her uncompromising pursuit of excellence. The boardroom fell silent as she entered. 12 pairs of eyes followed her movement to the head of the table, where holographic displays shimmered with statistical data and molecular models. Among the faces, she noticed Dr. James Chen, her lead researcher, barely containing his excitement about their breakthrough. "Ladies and gentlemen," Katherine began, her voice commanding attention, 25 years ago I watched my mother die of breast cancer. I was a young researcher then, helpless against the disease that took her from me. That day I made a promise to dedicate my life to finding better treatments for cancer patients. She gestured to the holographic display, which showed a complex molecular structure rotating in the air. Today we're not just introducing another treatment, we're revolutionizing how we fight cancer at the cellular level. Her presentation detailed the groundbreaking research, backed by 5 years of clinical trials and mountains of peer-reviewed data. The board members leaned forward, captivated by the potential impact and profit margins of their new treatment. Katherine had always insisted that their success would come from saving lives, not just pursuing profits. It was a philosophy that had transformed Grant Pharmaceuticals from a small startup into a global leader in cancer research. After the presentation, Dr. Chen approached her. "Katherine, the trial results are even better than we hoped. We're seeing an 87% response rate in patients who failed conventional treatments." Katherine allowed herself a small smile. "Schedule a press conference for next week. The world needs to know there's hope." She returned to her office, where walls of awards and medical patents testified to her achievements. But it was the small photograph on her desk that caught her eye. Her mother, smiling bravely through her illness, just months before she passed away. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with research teams, each presenting their progress on various projects. Katherine listened intently, asking pointed questions that often exposed oversights or suggested new avenues of investigation. Her mind worked like a supercomputer, processing complex medical data while considering market implications and regulatory requirements. As evening approached, she prepared for her daily ritual, visiting the research labs. The sub-level facilities were her true domain, where breakthrough discoveries were born. Scientists in white coats straightened their postures as she passed, her presence both inspiring and intimidating. In the main laboratory, she paused to examine cell cultures through a microscope. The cancer cells were dying, attacked by their revolutionary treatment. "Beautiful," she whispered, making notes on her tablet. This was where she felt most alive, in the pursuit of scientific truth, where data and evidence reigned supreme. The sharp pain caught her off guard, a sudden, searing headache that made her grip the laboratory bench for support. She had been experiencing these headaches for weeks, but had dismissed them as stress-related. Running a pharmaceutical empire while spearheading multiple research projects wasn't exactly a relaxing endeavor. "Ms. Grant," one of the researchers noticed her discomfort. "Are you all right?" Katherine straightened, masking her pain with practiced precision. "I'm fine, just a headache." But as she turned to leave, the room tilted sideways and darkness crept into the edges of her vision. The last thing she heard was the alarmed voices of her staff as she collapsed onto the sterile laboratory floor. She awoke in Massachusetts General Hospital, surrounded by beeping machines and concerned faces. Dr. Sarah Martinez, her personal physician and longtime friend, stood at her bedside, holding a tablet with imaging results. The look on Sarah's face made Katherine's blood run cold. "Katherine," Sarah began, her professional demeanor cracking slightly, "we found something on the MRI." The holographic display showed her brain scan, and there it was, an irregularly shaped mass nestled deep within her cerebral tissue. Katherine's analytical mind immediately began calculating statistics, survival rates, treatment options. The irony was not lost on her. The woman who had dedicated her life to fighting cancer was now facing her own battle. "It's a rare form of glioblastoma," Sarah continued, "with some unusual characteristics we haven't seen before. The location and structure make it particularly resistant to standard treatments." Katherine absorbed the information with clinical detachment. "What's the prognosis?" Sarah hesitated, then delivered the crushing blow. "Without effective treatment, 3 months, maybe 4. The world seemed to stop. Katherine Grant, who had built an empire on the foundation of scientific certainty, found herself facing an enemy that defied her weapons. The statistical models and clinical trials that had been her North Star now seemed to mock her with their cold probability. "Start mapping out treatment options," Katherine ordered, falling back on her professional expertise. "I want full genomic sequencing, molecular profiling, and access to every experimental treatment in our pipeline." But as she lay in the hospital bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the gravity of her situation began to sink in. The empire she had built, the breakthroughs she had achieved, the lives she had saved, none of it could guarantee her own survival. For the first time in decades, Katherine Grant felt something she had long forgotten: fear. Her phone buzzed with messages from board members and colleagues, but she ignored them all. Instead, she found herself looking at the photo of her mother, now saved as her phone's background. "I'm not ready," she whispered to the image. "There's still so much work to do." The irony of her situation was almost cruel. A woman who had devoted her life to fighting cancer, now facing a battle against it herself. As the night deepened and the hospital grew quiet, Katherine Grant, the empiricist, the scientist, the believer in cold, hard facts, felt the foundations of her world begin to crack. Little did she know that this diagnosis would lead her down a path that would challenge everything she believed about science, faith, and the nature of healing itself. The harsh fluorescent lights of Massachusetts General Hospital cast an unforgiving glow over Katherine's face as she reviewed her medical file. 2 weeks had passed since her collapse in the laboratory, and the stack of test results, scans, and medical opinions had grown into a mountain of increasingly grim data. Dr. Sarah Martinez entered the private room, accompanied by Dr. James Chen, who had temporarily set aside his research duties at Grant Pharmaceuticals to focus on his CEO's case. The concern etched on their faces told Katherine they weren't bringing good news. "The genomic sequencing results are back," Sarah began, pulling up the holographic display. "The tumor has a unique mutation pattern we've never encountered before. It's as if it's adapting to every treatment we throw at it." Katherine sat up straighter in her hospital bed, her analytical mind still sharp despite the increasing frequency of her headaches. "Show me the molecular structure," she demanded, studying the complex images that materialized in the air before her. Even in her condition, she remained the scientist, determined to understand every aspect of her disease. "We've tried 3 different experimental treatments from our advanced pipeline," Dr. Chen added, scrolling through the data. "The tumor appears to be developing resistance mechanisms at an unprecedented rate. It's unlike anything we've seen in our research." Katherine absorbed the information with practiced detachment, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the tablet. "What about the immunotherapy treatment we just developed? The one with the 87% response rate?" Sarah and James exchanged glances. "We administered it last week," Sarah replied gently. "The tumor showed no response. If anything, it seems to have accelerated its growth pattern." The irony was bitter. The very treatment that had given hope to thousands of patients had failed to make any impact on her own cancer. Katherine closed her eyes, fighting back a wave of nausea that she couldn't attribute entirely to her condition. "The board is asking questions," Dr. Chen said carefully. "They're concerned about the company's stability. There's talk of appointing an interim CEO." Katherine's eyes snapped open. "I built that company from nothing," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm not stepping down until—" She left the sentence unfinished, the weight of her prognosis hanging heavy in the air. Later that evening, alone in her room, Katherine forced herself to face the statistical reality of her situation. 3 months, 90 days, 2,160 hours. She had spent her career fighting to extend patients' lives, and now she found herself counting down her own remaining time. The headaches were getting worse, accompanied by occasional moments of confusion that terrified her more than the pain. Yesterday, she had forgotten her mother's name while looking at her photograph. The tumor was pressing against her temporal lobe, stealing not just her future but potentially her past as well. A soft knock at the door interrupted her dark thoughts. A woman entered, pushing a cleaning cart, someone Katherine had seen in the corridors but never really noticed before. She wore simple scrubs and a name tag that read, Maria. "Good evening, Ms. Grant," Maria said warmly, beginning her routine cleaning duties. "Would you like me to come back later?" Katherine waved her hand dismissively. "Go ahead, I'm just reviewing some files." She returned to her tablet, but found herself distracted by Maria's quiet humming as she worked. There was something peaceful about her presence, a calm that seemed out of place in the sterile hospital environment. "You know," Maria said as she cleaned near Katherine's bed, "I've seen many patients come through here. The ones who fight the hardest aren't always the strongest or the richest. They're the ones who find something to believe in." Katherine looked up, irritated by the unsolicited commentary. "I believe in science," she replied curtly, "in measurable results and proven treatments." Maria smiled, seemingly unaffected by Katherine's tone. "Science is a wonderful thing, but sometimes healing requires more than what we can see under a microscope." Before Katherine could formulate a suitably cutting response, another wave of pain crashed through her head. She gasped, dropping the tablet as her vision blurred. Through the haze, she felt Maria's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Breathe through it," Maria's voice came softly. "This too shall pass." When the pain subsided, Katherine found herself gripping Maria's hand, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "I'm dying," she whispered, speaking the words aloud for the first time. "All my knowledge, all my research, and I can't stop it." Maria's eyes filled with compassion. "Perhaps this is not a battle you're meant to fight alone." The following days brought a parade of specialists, each offering different treatment options that Katherine knew were ultimately futile. Her research team worked around the clock, testing new combinations of drugs, but each attempt was met with the same result: failure. The news of her condition had leaked to the media, and business reporters were having a field day speculating about the future of Grant Pharmaceuticals. The company's stock had dropped 15% in a single day. Katherine watched from her hospital bed as financial networks debated the irony of her situation, the cancer research pioneer facing a losing battle with the very disease she had sworn to cure. One morning, after a particularly rough night of pain and confusion, Katherine found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her face was gaunt, her designer clothes hanging loose on her frame. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her once commanding presence had diminished into something fragile and uncertain. "Your team is here for the morning briefing," her assistant announced through the door. Katherine straightened her spine, applied a fresh coat of lipstick, and stepped out to face her colleagues. She had to maintain the illusion of control, even as she felt it slipping away. The meeting was a blur of medical jargon and disappointing updates, but she nodded at appropriate intervals, making notes she could barely read. As the team filed out, Dr. Martinez lingered behind. "Katherine," she said softly, "there's something we need to discuss. The latest scans show increased pressure on your temporal lobe. We're going to start seeing more cognitive effects." "I know what it means, Sarah," Katherine interrupted. "I wrote papers on this. Her voice cracked. "I never thought I'd be the subject of such a study." That evening, Maria returned, this time staying longer than her cleaning duties required. She shared stories about other patients who had faced seemingly hopeless situations. Katherine found herself listening despite her skepticism, drawn to the quiet conviction in Maria's voice. "There's a small prayer group that meets in the hospital chapel," Maria mentioned casually as she prepared to leave. "Just people supporting each other through their battles. You might find it helpful." Katherine almost laughed at the suggestion. "Prayer? I'm a scientist. I deal in facts, not faith." Maria paused at the door. "Facts tell us how we're dying, Ms. Grant. Faith can teach us how to live." With that, she left Katherine alone with her thoughts and her pain. Later that night, unable to sleep, Katherine pulled up her research files. Years of clinical trials, breakthrough treatments, and saved lives scrolled before her eyes. She had achieved everything she had set out to do, except the one thing that mattered most now: finding a cure for herself. As she stared out her window at the Boston skyline, the empire she had built glittering in the distance, Katherine Grant faced the most difficult reality of her life. Science, her faithful companion and guiding light, had failed her, and in that moment of crushing clarity, she realized she might need to look beyond the boundaries of her carefully constructed worldview to find answers. The thought terrified her more than death itself. Maria Rodriguez had worked as a cleaner at Massachusetts General Hospital for 23 years, long enough to know that sometimes the most profound healing happened in the quiet moments between medical procedures. She watched Katherine Grant from a respectful distance, recognizing the familiar pattern of someone whose entire worldview was being dismantled by circumstances beyond their control. On this particular morning, Maria entered Katherine's room earlier than usual, finding the CEO awake and struggling with another headache. Medical charts and research papers were scattered across the bed, evidence of another sleepless night spent searching for answers in scientific literature. "Good morning, Ms. Grant," Maria said softly, mindful of Katherine's sensitivity to noise during her episodes. "Would you like me to come back later?" Katherine waved her in weakly, pressing her fingers against her temples. "No, stay, the silence is worse." Her voice, once commanding boardrooms, had grown thin and strained. As Maria went about her cleaning duties, she began humming softly, an old Spanish hymn her grandmother had taught her. She noticed Katherine's breathing gradually steadying, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "That melody," Katherine murmured. "What is it?" Maria paused in her work. "Something my grandmother used to sing in her darkest moments. She believed music could reach places medicine couldn't." She hesitated, then added, "Would you like to hear her story?" Katherine's initial instinct was to decline, but the pain made her desperate for any distraction. "Tell me," she whispered. Maria pulled up a chair, maintaining a professional distance while creating an intimate space for conversation. "My grandmother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer when I was just a girl. The doctors gave her 3 months to live." She noticed Katherine's slight flinch at the familiar time frame. "But she lived for 3 more years." "That's statistically improbable," Katherine interjected, her scientific mind automatically analyzing the information. "Pancreatic cancer has one of the lowest survival rates." "Yes," Maria agreed. "The doctors called her a medical miracle. They documented her case extensively. But what they couldn't document was her faith." She leaned forward slightly. "Every morning she would wake up before dawn to pray. She believed that healing came not just from medicine, but from a deep connection to something greater than ourselves." Katherine's skepticism was evident, but she didn't interrupt. Maria continued cleaning as she spoke, her movements efficient yet graceful. "I watched her defy every prediction, not because she denied science, but because she understood that healing involves more than just the body." "And you believe prayer healed her?" Katherine asked, her tone a mixture of doubt and desperate curiosity. "I believe prayer gave her peace and peace gave her strength," Maria replied. "The human spirit is powerful, Ms. Grant. Sometimes we forget that in our rush to measure and quantify everything." Throughout the day, Maria shared more stories between her duties, tales of patients she had witnessed over her 2 decades at the hospital. She spoke of seemingly miraculous recoveries and peaceful passings, of broken people finding wholeness and cynics discovering hope. "Why are you telling me all this?" Katherine finally asked, her defenses weakening under the weight of her illness and Maria's gentle persistence. Maria set down her cleaning supplies and met Katherine's gaze directly. "Because 23 years ago, when I started working here, I was running from my own pain. My son had just died from leukemia." She noted the surprise in Katherine's eyes. "I was angry at God, at medicine, at the whole world. But in cleaning these rooms, in witnessing both tragedy and triumph, I found my purpose." Katherine absorbed this information silently. She had passed this woman in the halls countless times, never imagining the depths of her experience or the wisdom she carried. "Your story," Katherine began hesitantly, "about your son. Did faith help you then?" Maria's eyes softened with remembered pain. "Faith didn't prevent my loss, but it helped me survive it. It taught me that even in our darkest moments, we're not alone." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "The prayer group I mentioned, it's not just about asking for miracles, it's about finding community in our struggles." As if on cue, another wave of pain swept through Katherine's head. This time, instead of withdrawing, Maria stayed close, her presence somehow making the pain more bearable. "When does this group meet?" Katherine asked after the episode passed, surprising both herself and Maria. "Every evening at 7 in the small chapel down the hall," Maria answered, trying to contain her joy at Katherine's interest. "We're meeting tonight, if you'd like to come." Katherine didn't commit, but she found herself watching the clock as evening approached. The thought of joining a prayer group seemed absurd. She, Katherine Grant, who had built an empire on scientific reasoning, sitting in a circle with strangers, asking for divine intervention. Yet as the day progressed, she thought about Maria's grandmother, about the power of belief, about the limitations of science that she was now facing so personally. Her own treatments had failed spectacularly, and her team was running out of options. At 6:45 that evening, Katherine surprised herself by asking a nurse to help her into a wheelchair. Her legs had grown weak from days in bed, and the headaches made walking treacherous. As she was wheeled toward the chapel, she caught sight of her reflection in a window, pale, thin, mortal. The mighty CEO reduced to this. Maria was waiting outside the chapel doors, her face lighting up at Katherine's arrival. "I'm so glad you came," she said warmly, but without the effusive enthusiasm that might have sent Katherine retreating. "I'm not sure why I'm here," Katherine admitted. "I don't even know if I believe in any of this." "Belief can start with simply showing up," Maria replied, opening the door to reveal a small, warmly lit room where a handful of people were already gathered. Sometimes that's enough. As Katherine was wheeled into the chapel, she realized she had passed this room hundreds of times during her visits to the hospital as a pharmaceutical executive. She had always dismissed it as irrelevant to the real work of healing that happened in the laboratories and operating rooms. Now she found herself crossing its threshold, not as a powerful CEO, but as a scared, sick woman, hoping to find something, anything beyond the cold comfort of statistical probability. The faces that turned to greet her showed no recognition of her status or accomplishments. Here, she was just another soul seeking solace in the midst of suffering, and for the first time since her diagnosis, Katherine Grant felt the heavy mantle of her identity begin to slip away, revealing the vulnerable human being beneath all the titles and achievements. Maria's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a gentle reminder that she wasn't alone. Whatever happened next, Katherine knew her relationship with this seemingly simple hospital cleaner had already begun to change her in ways she couldn't yet understand. The morning after her first encounter with the chapel, Katherine found herself back in her hospital room, surrounded by the familiar beeping of medical equipment and stacks of research papers. The experience had left her unsettled, questioning everything she had built her life upon. She thumbed through her latest brain scans, trying to focus on the tangible, the measurable, the scientific. Dr. Sarah Martinez entered with the morning's test results, her face bearing the strain of delivering consistently bad news to a friend. "The latest treatment isn't having the effect we hoped for," she said, pulling up the holographic display. "The tumor continues to grow and it's becoming more aggressive." Katherine nodded, her scientific mind still automatically calculating probabilities and survival rates. "What about the experimental treatment from Switzerland?" she asked, referring to a promising new therapy they had been trying to acquire. Sarah shook her head. "They're still in early trials. The regulatory hurdles." She left the sentence unfinished. They both knew time was a luxury Katherine no longer had. "Ms. Grant," her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "the board is requesting an emergency video conference." Katherine straightened in her bed, smoothing her silk robe, one of the few remnants of her former life she still clung to. "Put them through," she commanded, her voice stronger than she felt. The wall screen flickered to life, revealing 12 solemn faces. Thomas Reynolds, the lead director, spoke first. "Katherine, we've received the latest medical updates. Given the circumstances, we believe it's time to discuss succession planning." The words hit her like a physical blow. "I'm not dead yet, Thomas," she snapped, her trademark fire briefly returning. "No one's suggesting that," he replied carefully, "but the company needs stability. The stock has dropped 30% since your diagnosis became public. We have a responsibility to our shareholders." As the board members continued their carefully worded coup, Katherine felt a familiar pressure building in her head. The pain came in waves now, each one stronger than the last. She gripped the bed rails, trying to maintain her composure. "The board has voted," Thomas was saying, his voice seeming to come from far away. "We're appointing Dr. Chen as interim CEO, effective immediately. Of course, you'll retain your position as chairman emeritus." Katherine barely heard the rest. The room was spinning, voices blending into a cacophony of sound. As her vision blurred, she was vaguely aware of Dr. Martinez rushing forward, of the board members' concerned faces on the screen, of her own voice trying to protest. When she regained consciousness, the room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. Maria was there, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "How long was I out?" Katherine asked, her voice hoarse. "About an hour," Maria replied softly. "Dr. Martinez gave you something for the pain." Katherine turned her face away, feeling the hot sting of tears she refused to shed. "They took my company," she whispered. "Everything I built." Maria's hand stilled on her forehead. "Perhaps God is showing you that there's more to life than what we build." "Don't," Katherine warned, anger flaring. "Don't try to tell me this is part of some divine plan. I built that company from nothing. I saved lives. Her voice broke as another wave of pain washed over her. Maria waited patiently for the episode to pass. "You know," she said finally, "when my son was dying, I was so angry. I demanded answers from God, from the doctors, from anyone who would listen, but the answers never came in the way I expected." "I don't want philosophical platitudes," Katherine said through gritted teeth. "I want solutions." "Sometimes," Maria replied gently, "surrender is the solution." The word surrender hit Katherine like a slap. She had never surrendered to anything in her life. She had fought her way through medical school, built her company despite countless obstacles, and developed treatments that had saved thousands of lives. The idea of surrendering now seemed like a betrayal of everything she stood for. Yet as the days passed, Katherine found herself facing an enemy that didn't respond to her usual weapons. Her brilliant mind, her wealth, her determination, none of it seemed to matter against the relentless progression of her disease. One evening, after particularly difficult news about the tumor's growth, Katherine found herself wheeling her IV stand toward the chapel. She told herself she was just getting exercise, but her heart knew differently. The sound of soft singing drew her forward. Through the chapel door window, she could see the prayer group gathered. They were ordinary people, patients, family members, hospital staff, all united in their vulnerability and hope. Maria was there, her face serene as she led them in a hymn. Katherine's hand rested on the door handle, trembling slightly. Everything she believed in told her this was foolish, that she should return to her room and review more research papers. But for the first time in her life, science didn't have the answers she needed. As she stood there, paralyzed between rationality and desperation, a memory surfaced. Her mother in her final days, finding peace despite the pain. Katherine had attributed it to the morphine at the time, but now she wondered if there had been something more. "Are you going in?" Katherine turned to find Dr. Martinez standing behind her, still in her white coat from rounds. Katherine hesitated. "It seems ridiculous, doesn't it? Me, in a prayer group." Sarah's eyes softened with understanding. "You know what's ridiculous? Thinking we have to face everything alone." She gestured to the door. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we need help." Katherine's hand tightened on the door handle. "What about all our research, our belief in science?" "Science tells us how the universe works," Sarah replied, "but it doesn't always tell us how to live with what we discover." She squeezed Katherine's shoulder gently. "Go on, I'll check on you later." Taking a deep breath, Katherine pushed open the door. The singing stopped as heads turned toward her. Maria's face lit up with a warm smile, and she gestured to an empty chair in the circle. As Katherine wheeled herself forward, she felt the last vestiges of her resistance beginning to crumble. She wasn't surrendering to defeat, she realized, but to the possibility that there might be more to healing than she had allowed herself to believe. "Welcome," Maria said softly, and in that moment, Katherine Grant, former CEO, scientist, and lifelong skeptic, found herself doing the one thing she had never learned to do. She surrendered. The prayer group's voices rose again, surrounding her like a warm embrace, and for the first time since her diagnosis, Katherine felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. Not the peace of acceptance or resignation, but the peace of knowing that whatever happened next, she wasn't facing it alone. The empire she had built might be crumbling, but perhaps, just perhaps, something new was being built in its place. The small hospital chapel bore little resemblance to the sleek, modern boardrooms Katherine was accustomed to. Instead of polished marble and glass, worn wooden pews and simple stained glass windows created an atmosphere of humble reverence. The evening light filtered through colored glass, casting a kaleidoscope of warmth across the gathered faces. Katherine sat in her wheelchair at the edge of the circle, feeling distinctly out of place. The group was a diverse collection of souls. A young mother battling leukemia, an elderly man with advanced heart disease, a teenage boy recovering from a car accident, and several others whose stories she had yet to learn. Maria stood at the center, her presence somehow anchoring the disparate group together. "Tonight," Maria began, her voice gentle but clear, "we welcome a new friend to our circle. Katherine, would you like to introduce yourself?" Katherine's throat tightened. In countless board meetings and medical conferences, she had commanded attention effortlessly. But here, stripped of her titles and achievements, she found herself struggling for words. "I'm Katherine," she managed finally. She paused, the clinical terminology suddenly feeling inadequate. "I'm fighting brain cancer." "Fighting is exhausting, isn't it?" the young mother, Sarah, said with a knowing smile. That's why we're here, to help carry each other's burdens. The elderly man who introduced himself as Robert nodded. When I first came here, I couldn't even admit I was scared. Spent 40 years as a construction foreman, always being the strong one, but sometimes strength means letting others help you stand. As the group shared their stories, Katherine found herself drawn into their narratives. These weren't the carefully curated success stories she was used to presenting at medical conferences. They were raw, honest accounts of fear, pain, and unexpected hope. A middle-aged woman named Grace spoke about her daughter's recovery from a rare immune disorder. The doctors had given up, she said, her eyes meeting Katherine's. But we didn't. We prayed, yes, but more than that, we found strength in each other. Sometimes a miracle doesn't look like what we expect. But what about those who don't recover? Katherine couldn't help asking, her scientific mind still seeking empirical evidence. What about those who pray and still die? Maria finished gently. Prayer isn't a transaction, Katherine. It's not about bargaining with God or guaranteeing outcomes. It's about finding peace in the midst of uncertainty. The teenage boy Marcus shifted in his wheelchair. Before my accident, I was all about control. Star athlete, top grades, everything planned out. Then in one moment, everything changed. I was so angry at first, demanding to know why this happened to me. What changed? Katherine found herself asking. I realized I was asking the wrong question, he replied. Instead of why me, I started asking what now. That's when things began to shift. As the evening progressed, the group moved into prayer. Katherine sat awkwardly, unsure of the protocols or expectations. Maria seemed to sense her discomfort. Just listen, she whispered. You don't have to say anything. Sometimes being present is prayer enough. The prayers weren't what Katherine had expected. There were no grandiose pronouncements or demands for divine intervention. Instead, she heard simple expressions of gratitude, acknowledgements of fear, and gentle requests for strength. The honesty was disarming. Sarah, the young mother, prayed for energy to play with her children despite her fatigue. Robert asked for patience with his physical therapy. Marcus gave thanks for a new friend who visited him daily, bringing homework and normal teenage conversation to his hospital room. When it came to her turn, Katherine shook her head slightly, and Maria smoothly continued the circle. But something was happening inside her, a subtle shift in her perspective. These people weren't denying the reality of their situations or abandoning medical treatment. They were finding an additional source of strength, one that couldn't be measured in laboratory tests or clinical trials. After the formal prayers ended, the group naturally broke into smaller conversations. Katherine found herself approached by Grace, whose story had particularly intrigued her. Your company, Grace said quietly, developed the treatment that saved my daughter's life. She reached for Katherine's hand. Science and faith don't have to be enemies. They can work together like two wings of the same bird. The metaphor struck Katherine deeply. All her life, she had seen faith and science as opposing forces, but watching this group, she began to see a different possibility, one where empirical knowledge and spiritual comfort could coexist. As the evening drew to a close, Maria led them in a final song. The melody was simple, the words speaking of hope and peace. Katherine didn't sing, but she found herself swaying slightly to the rhythm, allowing the harmony of voices to wash over her. Same time tomorrow? Maria asked as she helped Katherine prepare to leave. Katherine hesitated. I'm not sure I believe in all this yet. Belief often starts as a tiny seed, Maria replied. It needs time nurturing, and sometimes a little help from others to grow. That night, back in her hospital room, Katherine noticed something had changed. The pain was still there, the prognosis unchanged, but the crushing weight of facing it alone had lifted slightly. She thought about the faces in the circle, each carrying their own burdens, yet finding strength in shared hope. She reached for her tablet, instinctively wanting to research prayer studies and statistical analyses of spiritual intervention in medical outcomes. Then she stopped, realizing that perhaps some things couldn't be quantified or measured in traditional ways. For the first time since her diagnosis, Katherine slept peacefully through the night. When she woke, the morning light seemed different somehow, not necessarily brighter, but gentler. As she watched the sun rise over Boston's skyline, she found herself whispering words she never thought she'd say. Thank you for showing me there might be more. She wasn't sure who or what she was thanking, but somehow that uncertainty felt less threatening than before. The scientist in her was still present, still questioning, still seeking evidence, but perhaps she realized there was room for more than one kind of truth in her life. The empire she had built stood gleaming in the distance, a testament to scientific achievement. But here in this hospital room, Katherine Grant was beginning to build something else. A bridge between the world she had always known and one she was just beginning to discover. The autumn evening settled over Boston like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an unseasonal warmth that left the hospital corridors uncomfortably stuffy. Katherine had been attending the prayer group for 2 weeks now, finding an unexpected solace in the simple ritual of gathering with others. Tonight, however, was different. Maria had invited her to participate in something more intense, a night-long prayer vigil. "Are you sure you're strong enough for this?" Dr. Martinez asked as she checked Katherine's vital signs. The latest scans showed the tumor continuing its relentless growth, and Katherine's episodes of confusion had become more frequent. "I need to try," Katherine replied, her voice carrying a determination that reminded Sarah of the CEO she'd first met years ago. "Besides, I'll be monitored the whole time." Indeed, Katherine's room had been transformed into a hybrid of medical surveillance and spiritual space. Monitoring equipment blinked silently alongside softly glowing candles, battery-operated per hospital regulations. The standard hospital machinery was complemented by a small portable EEG unit that Dr. Martinez had arranged to document any changes during the vigil. From a scientific perspective, Katherine managed a weak smile. Think of it as a controlled experiment. As twilight deepened into night, members of the prayer group began arriving. Sarah, the young mother with leukemia, brought hand-knitted prayer shawls. Robert came with his oxygen tank and decades of faith. Marcus wheeled in with his newly restored teenage optimism. They arranged themselves around Katherine's bed, creating an intimate circle in the sterile hospital room. Maria arrived last, carrying a small, worn Bible and a quiet authority that seemed to transform the medical space into something more sacred. "Tonight," she began, her voice soft but clear, "we gather not just to pray, but to witness. Sometimes healing comes in ways we don't expect." The monitors beeped steadily as the group began their prayers. Katherine closed her eyes, still feeling somewhat awkward but no longer resistant. The past weeks had taught her that there was a certain peace in simply being present, even if she didn't fully understand or believe. Hours passed. Some members of the group dozed briefly, only to be gently awakened by others. They took turns reading scriptures, sharing stories, and lifting their voices in quiet songs of hope. Katherine drifted in and out of awareness, the pain in her head a constant reminder of why they were there. Around midnight, something began to change. Katherine felt it first as a warmth in her chest, different from the fever she'd been fighting. The sensation spread gradually, moving up through her neck and into her head, where the tumor had made its home. The EEG machine registered the change first, subtle alterations in her brainwave patterns that caused Dr. Martinez, who had stayed to observe, to lean forward in her chair. The regular monitors showed slight but notable changes in Katherine's vital signs. "Something's happening," Katherine whispered, her voice trembling. The pain that had been her constant companion was shifting, transforming into something else, a sensation she couldn't quite describe. Maria moved closer, taking Katherine's hand. "Don't fight it," she said softly. "Just let it happen." The warmth intensified, and Katherine felt tears streaming down her face. Images flashed through her mind, her mother in her final days, telling her there was more to life than what could be measured, the countless patients she'd helped through her research, the simple faith of the people surrounding her now. The medical equipment began registering more significant changes. Her blood pressure, which had been elevated due to the tumor's pressure, started normalizing. The EEG showed patterns that Dr. Martinez had never seen before in their previous monitoring. "Katherine," Sarah's voice came through the haze, "you're glowing." Indeed, those in the room would later describe seeing a soft luminescence surrounding Katherine, though none of the medical equipment could capture or measure it. Dr. Martinez found herself standing between her scientific training and what her eyes were telling her was happening. The experience reached its peak around 3 in the morning. Katherine felt as though every cell in her body was being bathed in light. The pain that had dominated her existence for months transformed into something that felt like joy, pure, undiluted, and completely unmeasurable by any scientific instrument. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the intensity began to fade. Katherine fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, something she hadn't experienced since her diagnosis. The group continued their vigil, their prayers now filled with a sense of awe at what they had witnessed. Dawn broke over Boston, painting the hospital room in shades of rose and gold. Katherine opened her eyes to find Maria still holding her hand, her face peaceful but alert. The others were scattered around the room in various states of exhausted wonder, "How do you feel?" Dr. Martinez asked, already reviewing the night's medical data with professional curiosity. Katherine took a moment to assess herself. The familiar pain was different. Not gone entirely, but transformed somehow. "I feel," she searched for the right words, "like something has shifted." The morning brought a flurry of activity. Dr. Martinez ordered immediate scans, blood work, and a complete neurological workup. The scientific part of Katherine's mind was just as eager to quantify and understand what had happened. As the tests were being arranged, Katherine noticed Maria preparing to leave for her regular duties. "Wait," she called out. "What happened last night? Was that—" Maria smiled gently. "A miracle, perhaps, but remember, miracles aren't always about instant cures. Sometimes they're about changing how we see everything else." The tests would reveal something that defied medical explanation. The aggressive tumor that had resisted every known treatment showed signs of regression. The swelling in her brain had decreased significantly, and her blood work showed marked improvement. Dr. Martinez stared at the results, then at Katherine. "This is unprecedented," she said finally. "We need to document everything, run more tests, try to understand the mechanism." Katherine found herself smiling at her friend's scientific response. A week ago, she would have reacted the same way, demanding explanations and empirical evidence. Now, while she still valued the scientific process, she understood that some experiences transcended traditional measurement. News of the night's events spread quickly through the hospital. Some dismissed it as a temporary improvement, others sought rational explanations, and a few began to look at their own practices differently. Katherine herself felt caught between worlds, the scientist who wanted to understand and the patient who had experienced something beyond understanding. As the day progressed, members of the prayer group stopped by briefly to check on her. Each shared their own perspective on what they had witnessed, their simple faith neither demanding explanation nor denying the role of medicine. That evening, alone in her room, Katherine reached for her tablet. Instead of pulling up medical journals or research papers, she opened a blank document and began to write. She needed to capture this experience while it was still fresh, not as a scientific paper, but as a testimony to the possibility that healing could come through unexpected channels. The empire she had built still stood, its foundation still firm in science and research. But now perhaps there was room for something more, a bridge between the measurable and the miraculous, between what could be proven and what could only be experienced. As she wrote, Katherine realized that regardless of what the future held, she had been transformed. The scientist remained, but now she was accompanied by something new, a quiet acknowledgement that some truths couldn't be captured in clinical trials or statistical analyses. Outside her window, the city lights twinkled like stars, and for the first time since her diagnosis, Katherine felt truly at peace. Whether this was a physical healing or something else entirely, she knew she would never see the world quite the same way again. The morning after the vigil, Massachusetts General Hospital buzzed with barely contained excitement. Medical staff huddled around computer screens examining Katherine's latest scans with a mixture of disbelief and professional skepticism. The aggressive tumor that had defied all conventional treatments showed unmistakable signs of regression, a phenomenon that couldn't be explained by any known medical protocol. Dr. Sarah Martinez sat in her office, surrounded by multiple displays showing Katherine's test results from the past 24 hours. Her analytical mind struggled to reconcile the data before her with everything she knew about neurological oncology. The tumor hadn't just stopped growing, it was actively shrinking, and the surrounding brain tissue showed remarkable signs of healing. "We need to proceed carefully," she told the assembled team of specialists. "Run every test again, document everything." This could be unprecedented in medical literature. In her hospital room, Katherine experienced the familiar routine of medical examinations with a new perspective. Each blood draw, each scan, each neurological test was both a scientific necessity and a reminder of the inexplicable event she had experienced during the vigil. "Your numbers are extraordinary, Doctor," Chen said, reviewing her latest blood work. As interim CEO of Grant Pharmaceuticals and her former research director, he approached her case with particular interest. "The tumor markers have dropped by 60%. Even the most aggressive treatments rarely achieve such results." Katherine nodded, watching the play of emotions across her colleague's face. "You're trying to find a scientific explanation," she said softly. aren't you?" he countered, genuine curiosity in his voice. "The Katherine Grant I know would have every lab in the company working to understand the mechanism behind this regression." She smiled, acknowledging the truth in his words. "The Katherine Grant you knew would have dismissed what happened last night as scientifically impossible. But I was there, James. I experienced something that can't be captured in our data points or statistical analyses." Before Dr. Chen could respond, Maria entered the room with her cleaning cart, her presence somehow both humble and quietly triumphant. "Good morning," she said, her simple greeting carrying the weight of shared experience. Dr. Chen watched the interaction between the hospital cleaner and his former CEO with fascination. The Katherine he knew would have barely acknowledged the presence of support staff. Now she reached for Maria's hand with genuine warmth. "The doctors are amazed by the results," Katherine told Maria, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "God works in ways that amaze even the wisest among us," Maria replied simply, going about her duties with her usual quiet efficiency. Throughout the day, a parade of specialists came to examine Katherine. Each brought their own expertise, their own theories, their own attempts to categorize and understand what had happened. Neurologists suggested spontaneous regression. Oncologists proposed unknown immune responses. Research scientists requested tissue samples for genetic analysis. Katherine submitted to their examinations with patience, remembering how she would have reacted in their position. But something had fundamentally shifted within her. The drive to explain everything through scientific methodology no longer seemed as urgent as it once had. Late in the afternoon, Dr. Martinez returned with another set of scans. "The tumor has shrunk by 40%, she announced, displaying the images. "The swelling has decreased significantly, and we're seeing improved blood flow to affected areas. Katherine, this kind of improvement, it's beyond anything in medical literature." "What are you going to write in your report?" Katherine asked, genuinely curious about how the medical establishment would document what had happened. Sarah hesitated. "The facts are clear. Rapid tumor regression following a night of prayer vigil. But the implications, the medical community isn't equipped to discuss spiritual interventions in peer-reviewed journals. Perhaps it's time for that to change," Katherine suggested. "Maybe we need to expand our definition of healing." As evening approached, members of the prayer group began dropping by. Sarah, the young mother with leukemia, brought flowers. Robert came with his oxygen tank and a knowing smile. Marcus wheeled in with his parents, who had been skeptical of the prayer group until now. "The doctors are saying it's a miracle," Marcus said, his teenage enthusiasm breaking through medical protocol. "The doctors are saying it's unprecedented," Katherine corrected gently, but her smile acknowledged the truth in his words. Later that night, alone in her room, Katherine began documenting her experience, not in the clinical language of medical reports, but in the raw, honest words of personal testimony. She described the warmth, the light, the transformation she had felt. She wrote about the pain that had shaped her life for months and how it had changed during those hours of prayer. A soft knock interrupted her writing. Dr. Chen stood in the doorway holding a tablet with the latest test results. "The board wants to issue a statement," he said. "They're calling it a revolutionary breakthrough in spontaneous tumor regression. They want to launch a research initiative to study the mechanism." Katherine wasn't surprised. It was exactly how she would have responded before. "And what do you think, James?" He sat heavily in the chair beside her bed. "I think I've spent my entire career believing that science had all the answers. Now I'm not so sure." "Science is still valid," Katherine assured him. "All those treatments we developed, all the lives we saved, that work matters. But perhaps there's room for something more. The medical community won't accept divine intervention as an explanation," he warned. "They don't have to," Katherine replied, "but they also don't have to deny it. Maybe it's time for a new paradigm, one that creates space for both scientific advancement and spiritual healing." The next morning brought more tests, more amazed specialists, more attempts to categorize and explain what had happened. But Katherine's focus had shifted. While she cooperated with the medical protocols, her mind was already moving forward, seeing possibilities she had never considered before. She asked her assistant to bring her laptop, and between medical examinations, she began sketching out ideas for something new, a foundation that would bridge the gap between traditional medicine and spiritual healing. It would be revolutionary, challenging both the scientific establishment and religious institutions to think differently about the nature of healing. As she worked, Maria came in for her regular cleaning routine. "You're looking better," she observed, noting the color in Katherine's cheeks and the clarity in her eyes. "I feel better," Katherine agreed, "but it's more than physical healing. I feel purposeful again, but in a different way. Maria nodded, understanding. Sometimes God heals us so we can help heal others. Looking out her window at the Boston skyline, Katherine could see the Grant Pharmaceuticals building gleaming in the distance. It represented everything she had believed in: science, progress, empirical evidence. But now she saw something beyond those glass and steel towers. She saw possibility. The tumor was shrinking, yes, but the real miracle was the transformation happening within her. The scientist who had built an empire on measurable results was learning to embrace mystery. The CEO who had demanded explanations for everything was discovering the peace that came with accepting that some things couldn't be explained. As the sun set over Boston, Katherine Grant, former skeptic, current miracle, future bridge builder, began planning for a future she had never imagined. The cancer that had threatened to end her life had instead transformed it, leading her toward a new mission that would challenge everything she had ever believed about healing, faith, and the intersection of science and spirituality. The cure, she was beginning to understand, was just the beginning. 3 weeks after the miraculous night of the vigil, Katherine stood at the window of her hospital room, watching the early morning sun paint the Boston skyline in shades of gold. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed, not just by the physical healing that had left the medical community baffled, but by something deeper, more fundamental. The latest scans had confirmed what the doctors could scarcely believe. The aggressive tumor had shrunk by 80%, and her blood work showed no signs of the cancer that had once threatened to end her life. But even as the medical community scrambled to document and study her case, Katherine found herself focused on a different kind of transformation. "The board wants to meet with you," Dr. Chen announced, entering her room with a tablet displaying yet another set of miraculous test results. "They're talking about reinstating you as CEO." Katherine turned from the window, a slight smile playing on her lips. "And what do they expect to find, James? The same Katherine Grant who built the company on pure scientific rationalism?" He hesitated, studying her face. "They're hoping for it. The stock has rallied since news of your recovery leaked. The market loves a comeback story. But this isn't just a comeback story, is it?" She moved to sit in the comfortable chair that had replaced her hospital bed. "We both know it's something more profound than that." Before Dr. Chen could respond, Maria entered with her cleaning cart. Over the past weeks, the hospital cleaner had become more than just the catalyst for Katherine's healing. She had become a trusted friend and spiritual mentor. "Good morning," Maria said warmly, noting the tension in the room. "Am I interrupting?" "Not at all," Katherine replied. "We were just discussing the future of Grant Pharmaceuticals. The board wants me to return as if nothing has changed, as if I haven't changed." Maria went about her cleaning duties with her usual quiet efficiency, but her words carried wisdom. "Sometimes we must return to where we were to show others how far we've come." The truth of those words resonated with Katherine. She had spent the past weeks not just recovering physically, but reimagining her life's purpose. The journal she had been keeping was filled with ideas that would have seemed absurd to her former self, plans for a foundation that would bridge the gap between scientific medicine and spiritual healing. "I've been thinking," she told Dr. Chen, "about how we approach medical research. We've always focused exclusively on what we can measure, quantify, and replicate in clinical trials. But what if we're missing something crucial?" James settled into the chair opposite her, his scientific curiosity piqued despite his skepticism. "What are you suggesting?" "A new research division," Katherine explained, her voice growing animated. "One that studies the intersection of conventional medicine and spiritual healing, not to prove or disprove faith, but to understand how both approaches might work together. The scientific community would never accept—" "They don't have to accept it immediately," Katherine interrupted. "Remember when we first proposed immunotherapy? Everyone said we were chasing fantasies. Now it's standard treatment." Maria paused in her work, listening intently as Katherine continued to outline her vision. The woman speaking now was neither the purely rational CEO of the past, nor someone who had abandoned science for faith. Instead, she was something new, a bridge between worlds that had too long been seen as incompatible. Later that morning, Katherine met with Dr. E. Martinez for what would be one of her final checkups. As Sarah reviewed the latest results, she shook her head in continued amazement. "By all medical standards, you're completely healthy," she declared. "If I hadn't seen the original scans myself, I wouldn't believe you had ever been sick." "And how will you report this in the medical literature?" Katherine asked, genuinely curious. Sarah sat back, considering. "The facts are straightforward. Aggressive tumor, failed conventional treatments, spontaneous regression following a night of prayer. The challenge will be presenting it in a way that the medical community can accept, without dismissing it as an anomaly. Perhaps that's exactly what needs to change, Katherine suggested. Maybe it's time for the medical community to expand its perspective on what's possible. The conversation was interrupted by a call from the board. They had scheduled an emergency meeting for the following day, expecting Katherine to present her plans for reassuming leadership of the company. As she ended the call, she felt a familiar sense of purpose, but it was different now, tempered by humility and informed by her experience. That evening, Katherine attended the prayer group one last time before her discharge. The small chapel that had once seemed so foreign to her now felt like a sanctuary. The faces around her were no longer just fellow patients, but companions on a profound journey. "You're leaving us," Robert observed, his oxygen tank wheezing softly beside him. "The hospital, yes," Katherine replied, "but this journey is just beginning." Sarah, the young mother, reached for her hand. "Will you tell others about what happened, about what you experienced?" Katherine squeezed her hand gently. "I'll do more than tell them. I'm going to show them that there's room for both science and faith in healing, that we don't have to choose between medical advancement and spiritual growth." Maria led them in a final prayer, but Katherine's mind was already racing with plans. She saw now that her healing wasn't just for herself. It was a call to action, a mandate to bridge the gap between the empirical and the spiritual. The next morning, Katherine dressed in a business suit for the first time since her diagnosis. As she prepared to meet with the board, she reviewed her notes one last time. They expected a strategic plan for returning the company to its former glory. Instead, she would present them with a vision for transforming not just Grant Pharmaceuticals, but the entire approach to medical research and treatment. "Are you ready?" Dr. Chen asked, waiting to escort her to the meeting. Katherine looked at her reflection. No longer the hard-driven CEO focused solely on measurable results, nor simply a recipient of miraculous healing. She was something new, something that perhaps the world needed. A scientist who had encountered the divine and remained a scientist, a believer who hadn't abandoned reason. "I'm ready," she replied, picking up her presentation. "Materials. But I don't think they're ready for what I'm about to propose." As she walked through the hospital corridors one last time, Katherine Grant knew that her greatest transformation wasn't the healing of her body, it was the renewal of her purpose. She was about to challenge everything she had once built, not to tear it down, but to build something greater, a bridge between the world of scientific certainty and the realm of spiritual possibility. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The boardroom at Grant Pharmaceuticals fell into a stunned silence as Katherine concluded her presentation. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the faces of 12 executives trying to process what they had just heard. Her proposal was radical, transforming a portion of the company into a foundation that would bridge the gap between conventional medicine and spiritual healing. Thomas Reynolds, the lead director who had orchestrated her temporary removal as CEO, was the first to speak. "Katherine, while we're all overjoyed at your recovery, what you're proposing is unprecedented, converting 20% of our research budget to study the intersection of faith and medicine." Katherine stood confidently at the head of the table, her presence both familiar and somehow different from the CEO they had known before. "Unprecedented, yes, just like my own recovery, which none of our traditional treatments could achieve. But this isn't science," protested Dr. Wilson, head of research development. "How do we measure faith? How do we quantify spiritual experiences? Our shareholders expect returns based on concrete results." Katherine picked up a thick folder from the table. "These are the complete medical records of my case, empirical evidence of a healing that science cannot explain." But more importantly, she activated a holographic display showing statistics. "These are the numbers you care about. Studies showing that patients with strong spiritual support systems show improved recovery rates, reduced complications, and better overall outcomes." Dr. Chen, who had witnessed her transformation firsthand, leaned forward. "I've reviewed the preliminary proposal. What Katherine is suggesting isn't abandoning science, it's expanding our understanding of healing. Think about the potential market implications of being the first major pharmaceutical company to officially recognize and study the role of faith in medical treatment." The room buzzed with murmured discussions. Katherine could see the battle playing out on their faces, scientific skepticism warring with business opportunity, professional caution clashing with the undeniable evidence of her own case. The foundation would operate as a separate entity, Katherine continued, with its own board and funding structure. Initial focus would be on three main areas: research into documented cases of unexplained healing, development of integrated treatment protocols that combine traditional medicine with spiritual support, and education programs for medical professionals about the role of faith in patient care. "And you expect the medical community to take this seriously?" Thomas asked, though his tone had shifted from dismissal to curiosity. "They'll have to," Katherine replied, "because we'll approach it with the same rigor we apply to all our research. We're not asking science to prove faith. We're asking it to acknowledge that there might be aspects of healing we don't yet understand." Maria had helped her refine this vision during her final days in the hospital. The foundation would create spaces within major hospitals where patients could receive both cutting-edge medical treatment and spiritual support. It would fund research into cases like hers, not to replicate miracles, but to understand how to create environments where healing, in all its forms, could flourish. The initial investment would be $200 million, Katherine announced, causing several board members to shift uncomfortably. "A significant portion of my personal wealth will go toward this. I'm not asking the company to take a leap of faith. I'm asking it to make a calculated investment in the future of healthcare." As the discussion continued, Katherine could see the momentum shifting. The business minds in the room were beginning to see the potential: positive press coverage, new markets, pioneering a whole new approach to medical treatment. The scientists, while still skeptical, couldn't deny the data from her own case. "We'll need to structure this carefully," Thomas said finally. "The legal implications alone? I've already consulted with top healthcare attorneys," Katherine responded, sliding another document across the table. "The foundation can operate within all existing regulatory frameworks while pushing the boundaries of traditional research parameters." By early afternoon, the board had moved from resistance to tentative approval. Katherine's transformation had not just been personal. She was about to transform the company she had built, and possibly the entire approach to medical treatment. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Katherine assembled a team that reflected the dual nature of the Foundation's mission. Research scientists worked alongside spiritual counselors, medical doctors collaborated with religious scholars, and healthcare administrators learned to speak the language of holistic healing. The announcement of the Foundation's creation made headlines across the globe. "Pharmaceutical giant embraces faith-based healing," read one. "Science meets spirituality in revolutionary medical initiative," declared another. Katherine gave carefully chosen interviews, sharing her personal story while emphasizing the Foundation's commitment to rigorous research standards. 1 month after the board meeting, Katherine stood in what would become the Foundation's first integrated treatment center. The space had been designed to bridge worlds: state-of-the-art medical equipment shared space with meditation rooms, research laboratories opened onto peaceful gardens, and private prayer rooms were equipped with monitoring systems to study the physiological effects of spiritual practices. "What do you think?" she asked Maria, who had taken a leave from her hospital duties to help establish the Foundation's spiritual care protocols. Maria touched the wall of the prayer room gently. "It feels right. Not just a hospital, not just a church, something new." The first patients would arrive next week. They had selected 20 cases that traditional medicine had deemed hopeless, much like Katherine's had been. Each would receive the best available medical treatment alongside spiritual support, with every aspect of their care meticulously documented and studied. "Ms. Grant," her assistant interrupted, "Dr. Martinez is here with the final protocols for approval." Sarah entered, carrying a tablet filled with treatment guidelines that represented months of work, integrating medical best practices with spiritual care principles. "We're ready for the first group," she announced. "The medical community is watching us closely. They're skeptical but curious." "Let them be skeptical," Katherine replied. "We were all skeptics once." That evening, Katherine returned to the hospital chapel where her journey had begun. The small room was empty now, but she could still feel the echoes of prayers and hope that had transformed her life. She sat in silence, remembering the night of the vigil, the warmth that had filled her, the inexplicable healing that had followed. Her phone buzzed. Another interview request, this time from a major medical journal. They wanted to know how she reconciled her scientific background with her new embrace of faith-based healing. The answer, she had learned, wasn't about reconciliation at all. It was about recognition that both approaches had value, that healing could come through many channels. As she left the chapel, Katherine passed the corridor where she had first met Maria. The hospital cleaner had become an integral part of the Foundation's leadership, her simple wisdom helping to guide its development. Their unlikely friendship had become a symbol of what the Foundation stood for, the breaking down of barriers between different approaches to healing. The Foundation was more than just a new initiative. It was a testament to the possibility of transformation, both personal and institutional. It represented hope for those who had been told there was no hope, and a challenge to a medical establishment that had too often dismissed what it couldn't explain. Katherine's empire had not crumbled, it had evolved, and as she watched the sun set over Boston, she knew that this was just the beginning. The Foundation would face challenges, skepticism, and resistance, but it would also open doors to new understanding of how healing actually works. The scientist who had once demanded empirical evidence for everything had learned to embrace mystery without abandoning reason. The CEO who had built her success on measurable results had discovered that some of the most profound changes couldn't be measured at all. As night fell over the city, Katherine Grant smiled, knowing that her greatest work still lay ahead. The Foundation wasn't just about building bridges between science and faith. It was about transforming the very way we think about healing, one life at a time. 5 years had passed since the creation of the Grant Foundation for Integrated Healing, and Katherine Grant stood at the podium of the World Medical Conference in Geneva, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The audience before her represented the global medical establishment, scientists, doctors, researchers, and healthcare administrators from around the world. "When I began this journey," she started, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed the impossible, "I was a scientist who believed only in what could be measured, tested, and replicated. Today I stand before you as someone who has learned that healing is far more complex and far more beautiful than we once imagined." The screen behind her displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. The Foundation's integrated treatment centers, now operating in 12 countries, had documented recovery rates that consistently exceeded traditional medical expectations. Their research papers, published in leading medical journals, had sparked a revolution in how the healthcare community approached patient care. "We're not here to prove miracles," Katherine continued, addressing the skepticism that still lingered in some quarters. "We're here to expand our understanding of what healing truly means." In the front row, Maria sat beside Dr. Sarah Martinez, both women now respected leaders in their fields. Maria had evolved from hospital cleaner to the Foundation's director of spiritual care, her innate wisdom and experience helping to shape protocols that bridged the gap between medical treatment and spiritual support. Katherine clicked to the next slide, showing brain scans from their latest research. These images show measurable changes in patients during prayer and meditation. But more importantly, they represent our growing understanding that healing involves the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. The presentation continued, detailing the Foundation's achievements, groundbreaking research into the physiological effects of spiritual practices, development of integrated treatment protocols, and most significantly, thousands of cases where patients had exceeded their medical prognoses. After the conference, Katherine found herself in a small cafe overlooking Lake Geneva with Maria and Sarah. The three women had become an inseparable team, each bringing their unique perspective to the Foundation's mission. "Did you ever imagine this 5 years ago?" Sarah asked, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "When you were first diagnosed?" Katherine shook her head, remembering the desperate CEO who had seen her empire crumbling around her. "I was so certain I had all the answers back then. Now I understand that the best answers often come from asking better questions." Maria smiled, her face showing the wisdom that had guided Katherine through her darkest hours. "God's greatest miracles aren't always the healing themselves, but how they transform us and others through us." The Foundation had indeed transformed healthcare in ways few could have predicted. Major medical schools now included courses on spiritual care in their curricula. Hospitals were creating spaces for prayer and meditation alongside their high-tech treatment rooms. Even insurance companies had begun covering integrated care approaches, acknowledging their impact on patient outcomes. But perhaps the most profound change had been in the lives of individual patients. Katherine thought of Emma, a 12-year-old girl with an inoperable brain tumor who had been among their first patients. Traditional medicine had given her months to live. 5 years later, she was cancer-free and thriving. While the medical community debated whether to call it a miracle or spontaneous remission, Emma simply called it hope. "We're receiving more applications for new treatment centers," Sarah reported, pulling up data on her tablet. The demand is overwhelming, Katherine nodded, already planning the next phase of expansion. The foundation had grown far beyond its initial scope, becoming a global movement that was reshaping the future of healthcare. But with success came new challenges. The scientific community is still divided, she acknowledged. Some embrace our findings, others dismiss them as coincidence or placebo effect. But the results speak for themselves. The next morning, Katherine visited one of the Foundation's European treatment centers. The facility seamlessly blended advanced medical technology with spaces for spiritual reflection. In one room, a cancer patient received chemotherapy, while a spiritual counselor led her in meditation. In another, researchers documented physiological changes during prayer sessions. "Ms. Grant," a young doctor approached her, tablets in hand, "we've been analyzing the long-term data from our integrated treatment protocols. The results are remarkable." He showed her charts indicating significantly improved survival rates and quality of life measures among patients who received combined spiritual and medical care. Katherine studied the data with both her scientific mind and her transformed heart. The numbers validated their approach, but she knew the real story lay in the individual lives touched by their work. Later that day, she sat in on a support group session, watching as patients shared their stories of hope and healing. A businessman who had abandoned his faith years ago spoke of rediscovering purpose through his battle with illness. A young mother described how the integrated approach had helped her find peace amid her struggle. That evening, Katherine returned to her hotel room and opened her journal, the same one she had started during her own illness. Its pages chronicled not just her personal journey, but the birth and growth of a movement that was changing lives around the world. She began to write, "5 years ago, I thought I was building a bridge between science and faith. Now I understand that I was actually helping to restore something that should never have been divided in the first place. Healing has always been about more than medicine alone. We're not discovering new truths. We're remembering ancient ones." Her phone buzzed with a message from the Foundation's research team. Another unexplained recovery, another case that challenged conventional medical understanding. Katherine smiled, no longer needing to explain every mystery. She had learned that some truths could be embraced without being fully understood. The legacy of her transformation had grown far beyond her own healing. The Foundation had become a beacon of hope for those facing seemingly impossible odds, a challenge to the limitations of traditional medicine, and a testament to the power of integrating different approaches to healing. As she looked out over the lights of Geneva, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The empire she had built on pure science had not been destroyed. It had been transformed into something greater. Her life's work had not ended with her illness. It had evolved into a mission that would continue long after she was gone. The next generation of doctors was being trained to see patients as whole beings, not just collections of symptoms. Researchers were exploring the measurable effects of faith and prayer with the same rigor they applied to drug trials, and patients were finding hope in places where traditional medicine had said there was none. This was her true legacy, not just the buildings that bore her name or the research papers that documented their findings, but the lives transformed by the recognition that healing could come through many paths. The skeptical CEO who had once demanded proof for everything had become a pioneer in expanding the very definition of what proof could mean. As night fell over Geneva, Katherine Grant closed her journal and smiled. The Foundation would continue to grow, to challenge, to heal. But more importantly, it would continue to remind the world that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come not from discovering new truths, but from remembering what we had forgotten. That healing, in its deepest sense, has always been about treating the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. The legacy would live on, touching lives and transforming healthcare for generations to come. And somewhere in Boston, in a small hospital chapel where it all began, people still gathered to pray, to hope, and to heal. The end was just another beginning. Have you ever experienced a moment that completely transformed your perspective on faith and science? Katherine Grant's journey from skeptical CEO to spiritual pioneer reminds us that healing comes in many forms. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What touched you most about Katherine's transformation? Was it her struggle with accepting faith, her friendship with Maria, or perhaps the groundbreaking work of the Foundation?